It's a perennial question at this conference. What is national conservatism? How do we define it? I'm not going to answer that question, but I think, can say for sure what's the opposite of national conservatism, and that is international organizational progressivism maintained through a network of international bureaucracies. A vast and ever-growing constellation of international organizations and bodies of great size are consistently promulgating rules and norms intended to govern the lives of everyone in the world. The workings of these institutions, and often even their existence, is entirely obscure from those they intend to govern, and often even inscrutable to national governments that originally created these institutions. I will provide some examples of what we're talking about, and then suggest maybe some solutions. So the United Nations, of course, is the most famous of such institutions, but far from the only one. These institutions can be used by liberal Western governments to entrench progressive, cosmopolitan norms in ways that make them untouchable by national democratic processes. Examples of this include, recent examples, President Obama committing to the Paris Climate Accords in a way that, while perhaps technically non-binding because it did not receive Senate ratification, would of course be intended to be used by subsequent domestic officials as a source of mandatory policies and what international relations scholars call compliance pull. Or allowing the JCPOA and the condemnation of Israel to be anchored in Security Council resolutions where future presidents cannot touch them. Or, take another current example, the currently being negotiated WTO Pandemic Treaty. A treaty so complicated and intricate, few can understand what it actually does, and which sometimes seems to perhaps be not binding or non-mandatory, but at the same time will subsequently surely be cited as a source of binding rules and a shift of national authority towards an international organization. In short, a treaty that gives more in practice will give more authority to the WTO, WHO, World Health Organization, a body which could not find COVID in China and could not find terrorists in Hamas-run hospitals in Gaza. None of which has slowed down the bureaucratic impetus for the adoption of such a treaty. Another example, perhaps more obscure to an American audience, but one which I have been a bit involved in, is what's the Istanbul Convention, a treaty promulgated by the Council of Europe, not to be confused with the European Commission. International agencies never die, they just replicate and continue to persist. The convention is, by its own terms, not a treaty, it's a crusade. This is a treaty that is nominally about violence against women. The Council of Europe proudly declares that the treaty is a manifesto laying down a vision of society in which gender equality is fully achieved. How is it achieved? By changing society itself. Take, for example, Article 12, which requires countries that sign this treaty to, quote, take necessary measures to promote changes in the social and cultural patterns of behavior of women and men with a view to eradicating customs, traditions, and all other practices which are based on the idea of the inferiority of women or on stereotyped roles for women and men. In short, a mandate to national governments to fundamentally transform society. Other provisions require countries to recognize trans status, and the existence of multiple genders. If a country chooses not to join this treaty, it finds itself under pressure from a network of other international institutions, such as the European Union and the Venice Convention. Like many such international organizations, the Istanbul Convention comes with an interpretive body. This has become a common feature of such organizations. That is to say, a body which is supposed to interpret what its treaty means. These bodies inevitably adopt extraordinarily expansive, progressive interpretations of every word in the treaty, maximize the jurisdiction of the treaty, and while technically, again, are non-binding, are then subsequently cited and relied upon by domestic courts, progressive domestic courts, and bureaucrats in this magical process of the creation of new norms that have had no democratic imprimatur. Entry into these arrangements is easy. Exit almost never happens. The original hope for these institutions arose after World War II. The idea was that a set of structures could bring the world closer to what is called a norms-based world order. We'll follow rules rather than power. Given that the impetus for the creation of these institutions was originally, in part, motivated by the genocide of Jews, it's quite notable that a new attempt at the genocide of Jews has most clearly, and I think in like one big reveal, showed the absolute lack of moral authority and fundamental corruption of these institutions. Of course, the most famous such institution is the United Nations, which sits at the pinnacle of global bureaucratic systems. Its chief bureaucrat, the Secretary General, said of Hamas's attacks on October 7th, it didn't happen in a vacuum, i.e. justifying Hamas's atrocities. It wasn't a fluke. The Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs has simply said, Hamas is not a terrorist group. But maybe other agencies of the United Nations have fared better. We shouldn't judge them all by their leaders. Take UN Women, which is a UN agency dedicated to promoting the rights of women and combating sexual violence. UN Women came under heavy criticism for making no reference to the systematic and horrific use of sexual violence by Hamas on and after October 7th. And I have to say for the record, after several months of such criticism, they did actually issue a tweet which said, "We condemn the brutal attacks by Hamas on October 7th and call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages." That tweet was promptly deleted. So that's fairly shocking, but it's not quite as bad as UNRWA, which is an entire UN agency dedicated to the Palestinians, to what they call Palestinian refugees. Interestingly, UNRWA has as many employees, approximately, about 30,000 something, as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which is the UN agency that deals with all of the other refugees in the world. So what are all these 30,000 people going to do? Well, obviously they're going to be members of Hamas. And UNRWA is an organization, UN organization, that has been completely taken over by Hamas. And a takeover of such completeness, all of its facilities, all of its personnel, that it is impossible that this should not implicate also the most senior levels of the United Nations itself. Now, I have to say this is not the first time, by the way, that an international organization has been taken over by a Nazi-type organization. In the 1930s, Interpol, the International Police Cooperation Organization, which was one of the most visible international organizations of the time, was in fact co-opted by the Nazi Party. It was based in Vienna, and the Nazis managed to take it over. Actually, Heinrich was for a long time the head of, several years, the head of Interpol. The countries of the world didn't say, well, we have to stick with Interpol, because otherwise, how are we going to have police cooperation? Most countries said, well, now that it's run by Nazis, it's not really worth anything, and quit or stopped cooperating with Interpol until well after the war. Now, the United States contributes $18 million to the United Nations. This is what we get. Or take the International Criminal Court, which is not particularly international. Most people in the world do not fall within its jurisdiction. Is not particularly criminal. It has only convicted 4 people in its 20-some years of history of the atrocity crimes it was intended to prosecute, despite having a $130 million budget a year. These are all nice jobs, by the way, if you guys are looking. And it has decided to redeem itself with the lowest common denominator by prosecuting Israel. Now, Israel is not a member state, which should be alarming to any national conservative. The Palestinians, who claim to have given the ICC jurisdiction, are not a state at all. And Israel is now the only state being investigated, the only non-member state being investigated at the behest of a member that is not a state. So the court now acts without any jurisdiction, and even worse, issues charges of war crimes against Israeli leaders in what is clearly the most restrained war in modern times, with the lowest proportion of civilian casualties of any war in modern times. And the only way we're to understand this is a way of deterring Israel's self-defense. The only way Israel could have avoided these charges is by not fighting back. In fact, one of the principal charges against Prime Minister Netanyahu has been for the purposeful starvation of the civilian population. In other words, being charged for a crime which actually has not happened. Has actually not happened. Interestingly, Hamas officials, who quite clearly have withheld food from their population, were not charged. Now, such charges have only one effect. Now, the ICC, how does the ICC work? They don't have any police. So, what can they do? Really not much. But let's say they charge Sinwar, the head of Hamas, and they charge Netanyahu. What's the net effect? Sinwar is not worried, because bad actors know they have a high risk tolerance, and they know that either they succeed, in which case they will be sheikh, or they don't succeed, in which case they'll probably be dead. Leaders of liberal democracies who get elected and rotate in and out of power are thus going to be more deterred by the ICC, and thus the ICC in such contexts is basically a thumb on the scale in favor of autocratic fascist regimes in time of war. The standards for the law of war that it has created are none that the United States can ever comply with. It has basically declared that the siege imposed by Israel, the partial siege, is illegal. Now, the U.S. Defense Department Manual on the Law of War describes siege, including the blocking of food to the besieged area, as an integral part of military operations. In any war the United States fights, it is likely to violate the ICC's rules. But hey, it's okay, right? We don't have to worry, because America is not a member of the ICC. But Israel is also not a member. But we don't have to worry, because Israel is like small potatoes, vulnerable. America, who's going to stand up against America? Here's how it's going to work. The ICC actually knows that it is powerless to arrest anyone who it wants to arrest, and has actually never succeeded in prosecuting an incumbent leader. It relies on a strategy that it calls some cooperation with local authorities. What does that mean? Let's say a future President Trump is charged by the ICC for the conduct of any kind of military operation that might be necessitated. What happens then? In the short run, nothing. The US implements new sanctions on the ICC, implements sanctions on countries that may wish to comply with the arrest warrants. But then, let's say President Gavin Newsom comes into office. The ICC has provided for him, in such a case, the mechanism to deal with a domestic political problem. And that is indeed how the ICC intends to operate, both in Israel, right, to hope that Netanyahu's successors turn him in, and that is how they would operate in the United States. I want to say a final note about how these institutions function sociologically. They have a common bureaucratic culture and agenda. When I started dealing with diplomatic matters involving Europe, I was surprised anyone ever tried to come up with a European Union. The personality of a Greek and a Finn are fundamentally different. But the worldview of an official in the UN is no different from the worldview of an official in the ICC or any such organization. Together, they create a common culture of rules, which are said to be non-binding, and then, much like academics who created many of the doctrines that are plaguing our societies, they create these cities in their mind, which have no connection to reality, and then they force us all to live in them. The only way to push back on this is not to protest the particular policies that we may find unpalatable, but to seek to terminate the institutions themselves. Thank you.